unseren Gast von heute zu präsentieren. I'm very proud, I'm very happy to welcome you again here in this show, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. How is it in the United States at the moment in this turmoil of pre-election wars with stunning news almost every day?
Well, your European audience may not appreciate this, but the focus in the United States of most Americans is almost entirely on the southern border and the massive invasion of 10 million illegals who are being admitted without being vetted, without any sort of security for the American people. And everyone has concluded that these people will be repurposed as future voters for what we now call the Uniparty in Washington. This conglomerate that rules us in complete absence of any demonstrated interest in the American people. So one wonders how much longer this can go on. I suppose much of that depends on the economy, but that's where people are focused. That's the danger. People really aren't watching very carefully what happens in eastern Ukraine. They don't care. They never did. And they look a little bit at what happens in the Middle East, but as long as we don't become involved, I think they'll stay away from it.
But isn't that the good news in some sense that if the Americans lose interest in the war in Ukraine, that means that the perspective for peace could become more realistic?
No, simply because we are irrelevant to the government. The people that rule America are not the American citizens who walk into voting booths and turn in ballots. That's kind of a joke at this point. Washington is ruled by a political elite that is in the pockets of oligarchs, billionaires, and lobbies, whether it's the Israel lobby or it's the military-industrial defense lobby and any number of other interest groups, but behind those stand billionaires. And they effectively own the Congress and the White House. So those institutions are not really very responsive to the American people.
On the other hand, we see that a former president, Donald Trump, is triumphant in the pre-elections on the Republican side. Many people in Europe didn't think that possible. Do you think that Donald Trump has a true chance of becoming again American president? And what would that mean for the geopolitical situation in Europe?
Well, there's a chance that he could become president, but it presupposes that there's enough electoral integrity to ensure that if he wins, he's actually inaugurated. That's open to question. More and more evidence has come out over the last several years about the election in 2020. So frankly speaking, first question is, can anybody be elected in the midst of this electoral integrity problem? And I don't have an easy answer to that. Secondly, assuming that he does get in there, what does that mean for the rest of the government? The last time he was elected, every rally that he attended, whenever he spoke to the American people, he was greeted with these thunderous chants. And the chant was, build the wall, build the wall. In other words, secure the southern border. When he was finally elected, what did he do? He said he was going to address the problems in Obamacare, a new healthcare legislation. What happened on the border? Not much. This is the problem. I don't know, given what he's got around him in terms of people, that we should expect anything different. I hope so. I'm not sure that the election is going to matter very much. Mm-hmm. And there are no easy solutions to the enormous problems we confront. No one running right now, with the possible exception of RFK Jr., has offered any solutions. Now, Donald Trump says, well, I'm going to conduct the largest deportation operation in history. And everyone thinks that's impossible. Well, we deported 9 million Mexicans between 1929 and 1930. Under FDR, we deported another 3.5 million. Under Harry Truman, 2 million. Under Eisenhower, 1.5 million. So I think that could be done. The question is, will he be supported by anybody who matters in Congress? And remember that some of the same oligarchs, I like to use that term now, the billionaires who shape policymaking in Washington, who are interested in prosecuting wars in the Middle East and wars in eastern Ukraine aren't really interested in securing our borders or, frankly, in the American people. So there's no easy answer.
Mm-hmm. How politicized is the judiciary in the United States? We are surprised when we read reports about this verdict now in New York, where they said the former President Donald Trump had to pay 450 million US dollars because of a fraud case in which the banks are saying, well, we didn't lose 1 cent. I mean, there was a lot of, in some parts, critical reports reporting on that. Is the judicial system in the United States politicized in a way that they try to get rid of Trump in that sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's true. You know, the judicial system in the United States consists or is composed of people who were appointed to their jobs under several different administrations. And frankly, from 1992 onwards, most of those judges who were appointed stood to the left of center. There was some modest increment of more middle of the road, politically centrist judges under Trump, but frankly, the majority fall into the leftist camp. Mm-hmm. Now, some of that varies with geography. You know, I wouldn't want to be tried for anything in New York City or Washington, D.C., or I would fully expect whatever they accuse me of, whether I was guilty or not, I'd be found guilty and end up in jail. Mm-hmm. That's how serious the problem is. So, yes, again, everything that we Americans have taken for granted for 200 years has fallen apart. The institutions are facades. Behind them stand almost nothing. And public trust and confidence in these institutions is at an all-time low.
What was your impression as a military man, as a high officer of the armed forces of the United States? What was your impression of the interview Tucker Carlson with President Putin? What's the essence?
I think most of us view Tucker Carlson. When I say most of us, I'm talking about Americans in general, not just people in uniform. And when you talk about people in uniform, you always have to distinguish those at lower levels from the people at the top. And the senior ranks of the armed forces have been politicized for years. We can go all the way back to the Vietnam War. And until Kennedy was president, Eisenhower and his predecessors seldom, if ever, appeared in public with anyone in uniform. And when the various chiefs of staff of the Army or the Navy came over to testify in front of the Hill, either the Senate or the House, they wore civilian clothes because it was made very clear, don't wear your uniform and try to intimidate members. Wear civilian clothes and speak to them as American citizens. All of that went away in the 1960s. Mm. And since the 1960s, officers have been appointed to very high levels for the purpose of strengthening the political hands of the various administrations that have held power in the White House. In other words, if you stand next to a four-star and say, well, I'm here with General so-and-so, and you see all of these decorations, even though 90% of them are meaningless, the assumption is, oh, he must be right, or he wouldn't have this general with him. The general is backing him up. And of course, people were eager to be used as props for politicians that helped their careers, that got them appointed. You know, Milley was a wonderful example of that. Mm-hmm. And so is his successor. So were most of his predecessors. They were people that were user-friendly to whomever was in political power. Mm-hmm. So that's an enormous problem. So when you say, as a former professional soldier, how do I feel? Well, I see Tucker as a voice for freedom of speech, as someone who is a voice in the wilderness right now in the media in the United States, and for that matter, in the West. Mm-hmm. I've read a number of German reports that are just over the top. They make no sense at all, describing Tucker Carlson as some sort of Putin agent. They don't realize the numbers of people in their governments that are bought and paid for by people like Soros and others. Mm-hmm. Tucker isn't bought and paid for by anybody, and neither am I. And I'm happy to list my sources of income and compare those with the retired generals that they bring onto the mainstream media. And gosh, you're going to be surprised where their money comes from. So suddenly their message is very predictable. So no, I think it was a wonderful exercise in freedom of speech. And I would say that 90% of what President Putin said, I agreed with completely. It was accurate. It was not an attempt to fabricate anything. Where he fell apart, in my judgment, was his discussion of the outbreak of the Second World War. Mm-hmm. That was unfortunate. I wish he'd have left that out completely, because that was a blemish on an otherwise excellent discussion.
Interesting was that President Putin was somehow, that was my impression, trying to convince the West that first, he's not this crazy invader who wants to conquer the world, but that this is a conflict with the Ukraine, which has very old roots, ancient roots almost, and that he's still focused on negotiating. That was for me the essence of this interview. What is it for you? What was the most interesting thing you took out from that conversation?
No, I think you're right. As I said, what he said was truthful. The amazing part to me is that he continues to hold out hope that there will be a negotiating partner. And I would have thought that after his experience in 2022, when Boris Johnson showed up and destroyed the agreement that both sides had reached, it would have been clear to him that he wasn't going to have a negotiating partner. Mm-hmm. The second part is, I'm surprised that he is still open to doing business with us in any form, because we have lied to him repeatedly for years, and his predecessors. Now, here's something your viewers need to understand. Mr. Putin has always been known as friendly to the West, and he's probably, as a Russian senior leader, an individual who understands more about the West and appreciates it, particularly because of his years in Germany, than almost anyone else in the Russian political elite. And I would be very concerned about what happens at some point when President Putin is no longer in charge, because others around him, and many, many others who aspire to be in his place, are very hostile to the West in ways that should frighten everyone. So no, I agree with you. I think he did a wonderful job on that score. But of course, it doesn't make any difference what he says, because the media is in the hands of his opponents, and frankly, our opponents, the people that are oppressing us, who are keeping the borders open, who are rewarding millions of people for coming to the country, passing out cash, phones, plane tickets, bus tickets, whatever they can get, and dumping them inside our country, much as you experienced after 2015, thanks to Mrs. Merkel and others. This is what faces us. And it's going to, I think it's going to blow up in everyone's face, but it probably won't blow up dramatically until the downturn in the economy really, really hits home. I mean, because we can't afford them.
Yeah. What is interesting in the reactions we had in Germany and in Switzerland, a lot of people pushed this interview aside, saying, well, you know, Putin, he can say what he wants. He's this crazy dictator, he's this aggressor, he's this ruthless autocrat. And just 1 week after this interview, we have the incident in this Siberian camp where Alexei Navalny died. I mean, it's very hard to say what the reasons, what the circumstances are. We have heard voices now from the Ukraine. The spy chief Budanov said, "Well, I have to disappoint you. Navalny died of natural circumstances." It's very hard to say, but here in the West, in Europe, in Switzerland, people say, why do you listen to Putin? He's a killer. Look at Navalny. Look what he does to the opposition. What would you counter to these concerned voices who think Putin is this maniac, this killer on the throne in the Kremlin?
Well, even a broken clock is right twice a day, and Budanov, too, can occasionally tell the truth. I think he's telling the truth. We shouldn't be surprised by that. He's been through some very tough times. He's been through extensive surgeries. His health hasn't been good. So that's not impossible. I know that he was under consideration for some sort of trade with the West and the United States of key
Navalny.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And it appears, and this is certainly substantiated by, I think, his wife's presence at the Munich Security Conference, he was always seen as the future Zelensky of Russia, as the man who would take over and sell his country out to the West. And I think MI6 and CIA both viewed him in those terms. I can't prove that because I'm not on the inside, but that's what reliable sources tell me. But again, it doesn't make any difference because the media in the West is going to say what it says. The difference between, incidentally, you and us is that we have alternative media. I don't know how much alternative media you've actually got anymore. I mean, the stuff coming to me from Germany is absurd. I mean, the descriptions, completely fatuous nonsense. I don't know what to say. But we do have alternative sources of media, although there's an ongoing effort, obviously, to suppress it. And this is a sort of idea of theory of complicity, that anyone who doesn't conform automatically to the mainstream narrative is dangerous and disruptive, which means he's telling the truth. So I think Tucker told the truth to the extent that he could. I think the interview is a success. It had a big impact here, more so probably here than in Europe.
One has to stress the point that I haven't followed all your statements during this war, but when I heard you for the first time, I was always struck by your views and your predictions, which in my eyes seemed true. It came out as you predicted. And you were one of the very few voices, prominent voices, who said from the beginning that the Ukraine is fighting an unwinnable war. And in this fog of propaganda, which is foaming out of the media, I would like to ask you again now, looking at the current situation on the ground in the Ukraine, what are we seeing now? What is happening in the Ukraine at the moment in your eyes?
I think the Zelensky regime is falling apart. They're beginning to engage in mutual recrimination. The key people in the structure are attacking each other, blaming each other. The forces in the field, which have been crumbling slowly for many, many months, are now really falling apart very quickly. There is no appetite anywhere in Ukraine to send more men into action. There's great resistance to it. The secret police, the SBU, is rounding people up and shooting people, but it's not enough. At the same time, the population lives in mortal fear of the Zelensky regime. In fact, I spoke with someone who came back quite recently, within the last couple of days, who told me that the population in Ukraine is far more afraid of the SBU and the Zelensky regime than they are of the Russians. And they all would like this to end. But you're never going to hear that through the mainstream media. But I think that's where it is. Zelensky seems to be very busy trying to close deals, selling off as much of Ukraine as he can to various agricultural conglomerates and BlackRock, headed by Larry Fink and others. I don't think it's going to last much longer. What's amazing to me, again, is that the Russians have exercised so much patience. And at some point, I think their hand will be forced. Putin's hand will be forced. He's going to have to close up the distance to the river to be sure. They are going to retake Odessa. They will retake Kharkov. Those things are already in planning and execution in the case of Kharkov. They've got about 110, 120,000 troops moving towards Kharkov right now out of Kupiansk. They have 90 to 100,000 headed to Dnipro. We'll see those things happen. The question is, what do you do about this cancer in Kiev? If you're Putin, you've got to get rid of it. It would be nice if the Ukrainian military itself took things into hand and did something, but that hasn't happened. So at some point, their hand will be forced. And I know that the Russian General Staff is currently considering the mobilization of an additional 800,000 troops. Now, given that they're well over that number right now, what would they need an additional 800,000 troops to do? Well, if you get no agreement from the West, if no one will talk to you, if you cannot negotiate an end to this, you are compelled to march west. You will have to grudgingly cross the Dnieper River and hope that once you cross and start heading west, that people will take you seriously. I mean, the recent photographs and news about tactical nuclear weapons being moved further west inside Russia, that's not designed to frighten everybody per se, because they have no interest in using those things. It's a demonstration of resolve. And it's telling us, if you contemplate attacking us, we will deliver total war. and you will not win. I mean, that's the message. We hold a very weak hand. There's a reason that Chancellor Scholz and his colleagues have all laughed off Mr. Macron and his ridiculous statement about sending European forces or NATO forces into Ukraine. We certainly won't. We just cut 24,000 spaces out of the Army. The U.S. Army is now 450,000. That's a smaller number than the number of Ukrainian soldiers killed in the war. And now that number is out. I'm told now it's over 500,000, approaching 530,000. But for years, for months, people kept saying, oh, no, that's not true. Now people are beginning to admit the truth. It's harder and harder to conceal these things. 500,000 plus have been wounded. We're talking about a generation of Ukrainians whose lives have been destroyed. It's not going to last, but you would think if there were a shred of humanitarian interest in people in Ukraine, that Scholz and his colleagues would stand up and say enough is enough.
I mean, it is striking. When this war started, even the most renowned war correspondents wrote, this war, Russia will lose within several months. Their armed forces, totally outmoded, ancient. They're using tanks which are totally out of fashion. People were ridiculing the Russian armed forces, making fun of it. I mean, I remember colleagues of yours, or you would say, professional soldiers, generals like General Petraeus, but others saying, well, in the February 2023, Mariupol will be reconquered, all these scenarios. What would you say after these 2 years now? What is your assessment of the Russian army from a military standpoint? How competent is Putin as a military leader, and how competent are these armed forces of Russia?
A successful military commander always knows the limitations of his force as well as its potential. Without understanding limitations, you can't hope to be successful because you will demand either too much or too little of the force you command. He is someone who I think from the very beginning wanted a limited war, and he went in with very limited means, only to discover that those means were inadequate. He corrected that problem. And today, the Russian military is probably stronger, with higher morale, better discipline, better equipment, and better leaders at every level than it was in the 1980s. So I think it's probably the best of its kind, certainly in Eurasia, no question about it. And contrary to everybody's expectation, Mr. Putin has been strongly supported in what he's done. Of course, there's always a 15%, sometimes 20%, that doesn't like what any government does. But over 80%, I would estimate 85%, based upon what I heard just within the last couple of days, 85% of the Russian population, strongly supports what he's done. And he's been he's very reminiscent. This is going to sound strange to some of your listeners. He reminds me of Field Marshal Montgomery, who commanded the 8th Army in North Africa. Remember, the 8th Army had been beaten to a pulp. Over 250,000 men could not stand up to 34,000 Germans and 70,000 Italians. He understood he had a morale problem. He understood that he needed new training, new leadership. He needed new equipment. He took his time, and he built a better force. And then once he launched the force was very successful all the way through to the end of the Second World War, with a few minor exceptions. That's exactly what Mr. Putin and his generals have done. They built a very good force, but they never pushed it too far, too fast. They avoided unnecessary casualties, and they took advantage of this. We call it the revolution in military affairs, which very simply is the links between space-based surveillance, intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance, and strike systems, from mortars all the way up to tactical ballistic missiles. And he's annihilated the Ukrainians, who played repeatedly into his hands and attacked the absolutely impregnable defensive forces that were built to cover the flank, so to say, of this force that was being built up. It's worked brilliantly. We still haven't figured it out. We don't understand it. We haven't learned it. And people like Petraeus and others gave the Ukrainians terrible advice. because they treated the Russian military establishment as some sort of backward World War II anachronism that could be defeated by a modernized World War II force. It's failed miserably. But again, they are on the winning side, these retired generals and politicians, because they're well subsidized. They're well paid for having said what they did. Remember, the truth doesn't matter. That's the sad part. It's the message. The narrative is what counts. And if you supply the narrative and you pay people to repurpose and repeat the narrative over and over and over again, then you eventually convince everybody it's true. And remember, most Americans were never interested in Eastern Europe. Mm. And so when you step forward and say, well, all of these retired generals were wrong, people look at you sort of with a blank stare. Really? Oh, they're generals, aren't they? I mean, this is pathetic. It's tragic. Same thing's true in Great Britain, where you have lots of blowhards who are senior officers over there predicted the same nonsense.
Will NATO accept a Ukrainian defeat? I mean, all these leaders have talked themselves so much into demonizing Putin as kind of a new Hitler, as this some kind of crazy Alexander the Great who wants to conquer the whole world. I mean, can NATO just let Ukraine drop and say, okay, we were wrong, sorry, you sort out your own things? Or do you expect that there will be some kind of counter reaction by the West? Is the West even capable of countering this? Has Putin now the control of the situation? What would you say?
That's a good question. And I'm not sure that I'm in a good position to answer it, frankly. As I said before, I know what Americans are interested in. I know where they're focused. I don't know precisely in Europe what most European populations think. I do know that in Scandinavia, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, in the Germanic countries, there is still a willingness to march without much question in the direction that the government and the media tell them to move. It's disappointing. So I guess there are two possibilities. One is that we, after the fall elections, get some sort of change in direction, and that change in direction results in an American decision to essentially end our participation in this debacle. I don't expect anyone to stand up and say, we were wrong, we've done enormous damage. It'll be like Vietnam. Suddenly it vanishes from the airwaves. Mm-hmm. Our forces leave. They just pack it up and go away. It's what I keep trying to tell Europeans. We're a commercial power, but we're primarily an air and naval power. Mm-hmm. So when things don't go our way, we leave. That's the simple truth. That's one possibility. And then the Europeans say, oh, the Americans have abandoned this. They've left. Maybe it's time for us to do the same. That's one possibility. I don't think NATO will survive, friend. I'd be very surprised if it survives this whole crisis. Eventually, it'll go down. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, there's another disappointing possibility. And that is you remember this film called Untergang. And at the end of the film, the man who was playing, Bruno Ganz, who was playing Hitler, says, goodbye, I'm going into my office now to shoot myself or something. And you have this women standing out there and say, Mein Führer, what about the endgültiger Krieg, endgültiger Sieg? And he looks at them like, what are you, an idiot? I guess, it took a lot of Germans time to figure out that Soviet forces were really on the outskirts of Berlin. They couldn't believe it. And I'd say that our media has done an excellent job of misleading everybody in Europe and to a lesser extent here, because as I say, we do have alternative sources and people aren't really interested in it.
And you still have a New York Times, which astonishingly brought out this report last Sunday, where they said there are 12 CIA secret bunkers, more or less at the Russian border, since 10 years. I mean, it's amazing that our newspapers didn't even quote the New York Times. And the New York Times had to say, well, Putin was not so wrong after all, when he said that the Americans were really interfering, were really, on our outskirts in Ukraine. I mean, the Putin narrative was somehow confirmed by these reports. I mean, at least even the New York Times brings these kind of reports. This is a silver lining of some kind.
Well, what that really indicates, because we've been down this road before, where reports are leaked deliberately from the Intelligence Committee because the decision has been made to end everything, to basically begin the gradual retreat or withdrawal. We had similar experiences in the last year or so in Afghanistan. Now, we always knew that everything that was being said about Afghanistan was a lie. But again, it wasn't confirmed until near the end when it became clear, well, we're going to get out. And you have similar problems in the Middle East right now. We did that in Vietnam. It was only towards the end that you began to see the truth emerge. So I'm sure that the New York Times probably said, well, what do we lose by publishing this? Because it's probably going to happen anyway. They've leaked it. If we don't publish it, somebody else will. And we want to be able to say that we did tell the truth at some point. Because
so you would say this is like a mental preparation for leaving, for giving it all up?
I think so.
Yeah,
I think so.
We always end on an optimistic note in these not so optimistic times. And I want to ask you as a final question, I have a theory, an optimistic theory, and I just will present it to you very shortly, and you have to counter it, or probably you find it's somehow corresponding to reality. I think it's a gut feeling. Probably it's wishful thinking. I don't know. I think that the Russian president, who has now the upper hand militarily, he wants to, as he said, demilitarize the Ukraine. He doesn't want NATO in his garden. He wants to create a buffer zone with some kind of militarily non-threatful, whatever kind of rest state of Ukraine. But then he will, from a position of relative strength, stretch out his hand to the West, because the Russians and the Chinese are not very easy bedfellows. And the alliance of China and Russia is not really an alternative from the Russian perspective to the Russian relationship with the West, because my gut feeling is the Russians think, and especially Putin, they are some kind of Europeans. They want to have the Western respect. They want to be respected by the West. So the good news is, when Putin wins this war, he reaches his goals, then he has a position of relative strength, and then he will try to build a bridge again to the West. Is that realistic, or is this total wishful optimism?
Well, I think most of what you've said is accurate. And again, I go back to what I said earlier about Putin. Let's hope that Mr. Putin remains in office for the foreseeable future, because he's the one who does share your orientation towards the West, particularly towards Germany. He's someone who knows history, and he knows that the two world wars were anomalies. Those were exceptions in the history of the German and Russian-speaking peoples. The majority of Germans were always doing business with Russia and vice versa. The two benefited from each other. He sees it in those terms and would ultimately like to see that happen again. Having said that, he would like to have good relations with Poland. And he's made that very clear on numerous occasions. So that much, I think, is true. It's a mistake to attach too much significance to this Chinese thing in the sense that there's some problems there. China and Russia are perfectly made for each other. Why? Because Russia has all the resources, the abundance of minerals, you name it, and the agricultural products that China desperately needs. China needs oil. It needs coal. China consumes virtually all the coal that it mines for itself. It needs millions of tons more than that just to run its industries. It does not have vast natural gas pipelines all over the country, but it can distribute coal via trains and rail and road. There are a lot of things that the two need from each other, but that doesn't mean that there's hostility. Neither is interested in fighting the other. And remember that they both share similar views in terms of who is a future possible opponent. And that possible opponent is right now us, though I think that will diminish in the future because we're losing interest in this nonsense. There's no reason for us to be in Asia with military power. That's all nonsense. The Chinese are not an aggressive military power. So what do the Russians and Chinese share in terms of a view of the future? It's called Japan. Japan is a juggernaut. Japan is unlike any other country in Asia. Japan is a hugely powerful scientific industrial state with excellent armed forces that could overnight defeat anything sent against them. Now, the Japanese don't want a war either. Okay, let's not get confused. But if you're Russian and you're Chinese, you worry about us, but you say, well, the Americans, they may pull out anyway. They're not in Asia, but who's here to stay? Who do we worry about? That's Japan. There are a lot more reasons for the Russians and the Chinese to cooperate than to struggle with each other. So I wouldn't attach too much significance to that. But everything else you've said is true. And I don't think that's a new development in Russian history. And I hope that someone in Berlin wakes up, smells the coffee, and recognizes this is all nonsense. By the way, if you look at what happened with the Nord Stream 2 or Nord Stream 1, back in the 50s and the 60s, the United States went to great lengths to ensure that the EU did not buy natural gas and oil from Russia to the extent that we could. We obstructed it then. We've obstructed it again recently during this Russo-Ukrainian war. Why? Because at the time, it was the Cold War, and we were trying to isolate the Soviet Union, which represented an existential threat to us in the West. It was real. That's not true today. There's no reason for it. The Europeans need to wake up and figure that out. The Russians, by the way, if you were sitting in Moscow and you looked west and you look at what's going on in Germany, Sweden, France, my God, why would you want anything to do with managing those countries? Those societies are in trouble. Those countries are in turmoil. The Russians aren't interested in that. They want to ensure that their society survives and flourishes. So the whole business about Russian offensives aimed at the West is just nonsense. It's got to go away.
It's so interesting, so fascinating. I mean, I had so many associations when you were talking, or I was thinking of a very provocative question to end our discussion. And the provocative question would be, you can be put into prison probably in Germany for asking this, but the longer I look at it, and of course it's very difficult to make a final judgment on current events, but I just thought of a statement by the American director Oliver Stone, who said in an interview with Die Weltwoche many years ago, 7 years ago probably, he said, we asked him, what do you think about President Putin? After he had this very long conversation. And Oliver Stone said, well, to me, he seems like probably the most reasonable man in this madhouse of idiots crowding our political arena. Is Oliver Stone so completely wrong with his statement?
No. And the problem for us is that if you look at President Modi in India, look at President Xi in China, President Putin in Moscow, those men have been around for years. They all know each other very well. How many people do we have in power today who have any real experience of wielding power for more than a few years? Very, very few. And what kind of a structure did those three men emerge from? Whereas you don't get to the top in India or China or Russia by being stupid. Get there by being extraordinarily intelligent, well-informed, and of course, ruthless, determined, all of those things. What have we got? It's sort of amateur hour in the West. This is the most unimpressive collection of people I can imagine. It's certainly in my lifetime. When I remember visiting for the first time in the early 80s, the German Foreign Office in Berlin. There were still people in that Foreign Office whose fathers and grandfathers had served in the German Foreign Office. You're talking about people that went back before World War I. These were products in that line. They were highly educated, very thoughtful people. They could quote in great detail GDP figures for every country. They spoke multiple languages brilliantly. They knew everything that was happening around them. And there was none of this hostility or hatred. It was all very objective, very matter-of-fact and fact-based. No emotion. And see, that's the problem. We tend to appeal to emotion over reason all the time, and it seems to win. And perhaps this is one of the unfortunate downsides of Republican government. I don't know. But I think we are at the end of a disappointing era. The West, certainly in terms of leadership, has reached entropy. We have, I think, as you say in German, lots of leere Schüssel.
The professionals and the amateurs. To quote one of your favorites, I guess, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, he said, famous saying, nichts ist schwerer zu ertragen als eine Folge von guten Tagen. Nothing is harder to bear than a series of successful days. And this decadence you are describing so eloquently in the West is somehow the product of the success of the West and of these eternal circles you always see in societies. But isn't Modi, Xi Jinping, Putin, at the end of the day, this kind of blow of reality, the knockout of reality that could wake up the West to remember its own strengths and qualities? I think, yes, I'm still optimistic about Europe. Europe has been dead so many times, fallen so many times. Now we are at a certain low, but these enemies, so to speak, as they say, could be somehow the punch we needed to wake up. You agree?
It could be, but interestingly enough, I don't think they're interested in punching us. They are building on the foundation of this thing we call BRICS. Mm-hmm. They're developing a new gold-backed currency. They're getting out from under our financial system. We're going to be left alone. Now, whether or not anybody comes to terms with the reality that our living standards are falling, that our industries are kaput, I don't know. I mean, I would certainly hope so, but there just isn't a whole hell of a lot of leadership on the horizon right now. So it'll have to come from someplace we never expected. I just don't want it to be the kind of leadership that emerged after 1789 in France.
Well, Colonel, let's hope that bad times bring out good leaders. Thank you very much for this discussion. Again, always fascinating, always enlightening. All the best to you and the United States.
Thanks very much.